Thank you, dear friends, for rejoining me, Mukesh Kapila, to breathe life into fading causes. Now, you'd have to be living on the moon not to realize that Sudan has been in vicious civil war for most of its 70 years of existence. And surely you'll have heard of the increasing brutality of that war. Even if we are somewhat numb to the vicious targeting of civilians in the numerous conflicts that are waging around the world, Sudan is, by any standard of evil, the worst. And I say that as a reluctant graduate of inhumanity measurement, particularly around Sudan, where I was the head of the United Nations some 20 years ago, when the first genocide of the millennium in Darfur took place on my watch. Could anything beat that, I wondered? Well, apparently, yes, as the horrors I saw then are not just being repeated now in the same Darfur and Sudan, but in ever more creative and cruel ways. The technology and other advancements of our age are also being marked by progress in the perverse science of inflicting inhumanity and cruelty. This is a big topic. So, in this conversation, we focus on just one aspect: sexual violence, or shall we put it a bit more directly, rape in all its horrific forms. What's happening, how, and why is it being tolerated? My guest to discuss this is the Egyptian Turkish journalist and investigations producer who has studied this at close quarters. Welcome, Rahmet Elfikhi.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mukesh, for having me today. I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. I hope it would be fruitful.
Rahmet, you have just released a documentary made with your colleagues at TRT Arabi, the Arabic channel of the International Turkish Radio and TV, called Land of Victims. What's it about? And where did the idea of doing this come from?
Yeah, let me tell you. So it's a long story. So together with director Islam Akl, we produced this documentary, Land of the Victims, that sheds light on the crime of rape in Sudan, basically. So, and also it focuses on how it has been used systematically as a weapon of war by the RSF against Sudanese civilians. So actually the idea of this documentary started earlier when Islam and I were working on an investigative military documentary about the siege of the Sudanese general headquarters by the RSF, and how General al-Burhan managed to escape that siege and regain control over large areas inside Sudan. So during that period, the brutal scenes and the multiple crises we witnessed made us actually stop and reconsider, as we felt that focusing only on the military aspect was not enough at all. So we decided that there was an urgent need for a humanitarian documentary that documents the crimes of war through the experiences, not only of like politicians and military professionals, but also as experiences of civilians themselves, as their voice need to be heard. So during our research, we noticed that one crime and only one crime was being particularly used in a deliberate and organized way, making this war different from many others in the world, which is rape. So we found numerous videos of RSF soldiers openly, and I mean it openly, boasting about committing rape and horrifying cases like that of Qasma Ali. I don't know if you heard about this case or not. So, and many more others. So that made it impossible for us to look away as journalists. So at this point, we made a clear decision to focus entirely on the rape crime. And this is, I think, how Land of the Victims were born.
Well, Raman, it's really a powerful film. There is other reportage around rape in war, but yours is relatively unique in giving centrality to the voices of the victims, the survivors. Filming that required a lot of care, courage, and organization in a very sensitive context. Tell me a bit more on how you went about finding the people to speak with, winning their trust, and getting them to open up to you on such intimate and traumatic experiences with the ethical and sensitivity concerns obviously involved.
Well, that's a good question. In reality, finding survivors willing to speak wasn't easy at all. It was extremely difficult. This is a very deeply sensitive issue, especially we're talking about an Arab and Sudanese social context where survivors face enormous pressure and stigma as well. So during our first visit to Sudan, the director Islam Aql connected with many local journalists who helped us to reach out to some survivors. And also, I reached out to human rights activists, including Sulaima Ishaq, who's now a minister at the Sudanese administration and who played a crucial role in helping us to connect with survivors and was one of our guests at the documentary. And also, I contacted with Nawal Center, which supports children born as a result of rape. In this process took months, so a long period of time to so earning the survivors' trust, we made very clear through our intermediaries, even before we get in touch with those survivors, a couple of points. First, that their names would never be used, and also their voices and faces wouldn't be shown. Filming also would take place in locations called safe end. So we made that point very clear to them. And we told them that if, for example, a survivor was a woman, the interviewer would also be a woman. And we did the same thing with men. Again, one of the things we also clarified was that they would never be forced to share any detail they didn't want to share. And I think this approach made a real difference in how we earned their trust. In fact, during our first visit to Sudan, we conducted 2 interviews with women who were crying throughout the entire conversation. So the team decided to stop the interviews and not use them at all.
Hmm.
Although viewing their stories would help us to earn more viewers, but out of respect and for their emotional state and protecting our ethics as a journalist to protect their own image and to protect the survivors should also come first. So we didn't use those interviews at all.
Right. Well, the obvious respect and care with which you talked to your interviewees, the survivors, comes out in the film, and well done. But you must have taken, as you said, many, many hours of film to distill the 45 minutes that you show. What were the editing and production challenges afterwards to ensure you told a balanced story that captured not just the substance of the horrible things that had happened, but also the overall spirit of the story, the context, and so on? Because we live in a mistrustful age when even the mainstream media is open to misconduct charges, as with BBC, who admit having misleadingly edited a story about President Trump.
This is actually a very important question, especially today. Unfortunately, we are living in an era of fabricated narratives, manipulation, disinformation, and the real disaster, is that this is done by major media institutions, which is really saddening me. We've seen this in multiple cases, especially during the war on Gaza. And as for our documentary Land of the Victims, we faced many challenges. So during production and editing, one of the biggest challenges was verifying survivors' testimonies through mental health professionals in trusted institutions. So we did work with them to make sure that those survivors are survivors of war and of this crime, because we as journalists cannot just publish anything and contribute to this era of disinformation and manipulation just to prove a specific hypothesis. So another challenge was that there's a large amount of content circulating on social media related to many crimes done by the RSF in Sudan, especially the rape crime. And while some of it could have served the story visually, we made the conscious and ethical decision not to include such material to our documentary because using them would violate journalistic ethics and also harm the survivors. And I told you before that for us, respecting and protecting survivors would always come first. Again, the most difficult part of editing was choosing words from their interviews, as some statements, while so powerful, could have supported our own narrative, but it could have revealed locations and identities of those survivors, putting them at risk. Other lines might have served the narratives, but caused further psychological harm for the survivors. So again, we didn't use them. So for us, dignity, mental health, and safety of survivors were non-negotiable. As you know, we are not social media influencers. We shouldn't be chasing trends. We are journalists. So we should only focus on telling the truth with responsibility.
The care and professionalism with which you've done the job, which was obviously complex, sets a standard in the way these things should be done. Now, to bring more humanity and meaning to the stark reality you portray, can you share the sense of two or three stories narrated therein? What are the documentary's key messages, for example?
Sure. So I would say, as a journalist and as a woman, listening to their stories, both included in the film and those that we decided not to include, has been incredibly heavy. Some of them are still haunting me until today. I remember that one survivor, a 7-year-old girl, told us that 7 RSF soldier raped her in a gang assault, and then they killed her aunt in front of her. I cannot comprehend how a child that young can survive such pain. So today she's an orphan, raped, traumatized, and witnessed the murder of the only caregiver she had. This is so sad. If I tell like another story, was a woman whose mother told her, I won't ever forget this sentence. She told her, run to a place where the RSF is not present, but if you are raped, don't come home again. So she was raped, unfortunately, after that. And out of fear, out of shame, the girl threw her SIM card away and chose to live alone. So cut off from all her family who are still alive. So for her, her family is now dead because stigma killed that connection. Shame and stigma have driven many survivors to suicide in Sudan, which is really a big problem. That's why actually that idea of land of the victims was born. So the film shows that sexual violence in Sudan is not the result of isolated incidents or wartime chaos, but that rape was a systematic practice used as a weapon to humiliate Sudanese society, to break it, to impose control on its fortunes. It also demonstrates that this violence does not destroy the victim only, but leaves lasting impact on the entire community, including family breakdown, also psychological trauma and social fractures that undermine any real chance of peace in Sudan. So it further emphasizes our biggest message that we wanted to deliver from this movie, that impunity is the main factor enabling these crimes to continue and escalate, and silence, both locally and internationally, is not at all a neutral position, but a form of complicity that allows the violence in Sudan to persist without accountability. Because if you don't hold that criminal accountable for what he does, he would easily continue doing this because there is no accountability.
Stark and clear. And dear listeners, this documentary really needs watching. Don't avert your eyes. Now, having watched this, what do you want people to do? This is a question in three parts. So let's start with the first part. What do you want the Sudanese to do in terms of the sexual tortures being inflicted from within their own people on their own people? I ask because it's often said that real solutions come from within and can't be imposed from outside when they likely fail.
That's a very good question. So What I want from Sudanese people is to talk about this crime openly. That is most important, to break this silence and start taking real action to support survivors, not only through psychological support or reparations, but also, most importantly, through legal accountability and prosecution. So only then can we say that this documentary has achieved its purpose. So our role as journalists is not actually to reveal the truth and to raise awareness so that real social change can begin. Let me tell you something. What saddened us deeply was that many Sudanese celebrities, activists, researchers, journalists even refused to talk about this documentary at all. And you know why? The responses actually revealed how deeply stigma is rooted in society. This doesn't apply to everyone, of course. Many voices are speaking out, but still there is a very clear and painful silence among many others who doesn't want even to recognize that such a crime is going on in Sudan. It's very shameful for someone, especially if you are a journalist, if you are a celebrity, if you are someone who is well known, to keep silent about such a crime that is going on in your own society, because problems are only solved through talking about them. And so first you recognize it, and then you reveal the truth. You start talking about solutions. But if you choose to being silent, how can you solve such a problem?
Absolutely. Now, Sudan is at the crossroads between the Arab world and the African world. So, my second question is, what do you want the Arab, Middle Eastern, and African people to do about the horrors being visited upon their brothers and sisters in their part of the world? I ask because in today's geopolitics, there is so much talk of, for example, African solutions to African problems.
Yeah, that's a very good question again. I didn't think about this about this before, especially when it comes to rape to Sudan, as we are, as children of the Middle East and people of Africa, unfortunately, we are neglecting our own problems. And then we go and ask others and outsiders to come to our own regions to search for solutions for us. So we're starting blaming the world. I know that we are standing today on the edge of a global collapse. Like, the international system was built after World War II has failed, and its institutions have failed to bring peace or justice. So they actually have protected the interests of a few powerful states while marginalizing entire societies and entire regions. So we are entering, I think, in a new world order. And I hope that what the West once called third world will finally have a stronger voice that would protect us, protect its own people, its own interests. So I hope that we have a new institutions that will emerge both in our region and in the world, that truly represent us, represent our problems, represent our voice and our interests as well, because the world is bigger than five permanent members of the Security Council who are doing nothing other than chasing their own interests. So I no longer rely on international institutions or governments. And unfortunately, we also lack effective regional institutions and democratic governments that would do a collective act to help their own people. So now I rely on people, both regionally and internationally, on civil society organizations, on grassroots movements, on pressure groups within especially powerful countries that can push their governments to stop supporting wars in our own region. And above all, I believe that we as people of Africa, people of the Middle East, of this region, which is not poor, but the West, after exploiting us, has convinced us that we are poor, but we are not actually. We can do many things if we were let to use our own fortunes. So I believe that we, as people of this region, must create our own solutions and stop waiting for justice to come from outside. So we should to help ourselves actually, but this won't come true if we are fragmented. So unity should come first.
So, in fact, you almost answered my next question, which was going to be beyond Africa and the Middle East, what do you want the rest of the world to do? Now, you already mentioned that global institutions are failing the world, and not just in that region, but elsewhere. And so you pin your hopes on civil society? You want ordinary people from around the world to do something if the
Yeah.
world institutions are not doing anything. So, what can
Yeah.
ordinary people around the world do?
They can actually put pressure on their countries so they can push their governments to stop supporting war, supporting chaos in our region. So, for example, we can take the war in Gaza as an example, especially the United States. So, people actually started to wake up. They started to understand that they are giving their own taxes only to support genocide. So they started to say that we should stop this, we should protest, we shouldn't elect people who are supporting genocide. We should talk about Palestine, we should talk about their own rights and their own interests. So this is one thing that they can do, protesting. Another thing is cutting giving their money, like their taxes, to those governments who are supporting wars and genocide. So this is really important.
Okay. Well, can we turn to a broader discussion inspired by your story? You know, all faiths strongly condemn sexual violence. As a Muslim, can you tell us what mainstream Islam says on this topic? On, for example, the blame and the stigma that often accompanies women that have been raped, and you've already described that very well, and the children that may ensue, and around accountability of the perpetrators and justice and compensation for victims. What does Islam say?
That's a hard question. Okay, so from where I can start. In Islam, sexual violence is a grave crime. It's a direct violation of human dignity. And there is no scholarly disagreement, both classical or contemporary, that the victim bears no sin or moral responsibility. So the prophetic principle, like the principle of our prophet, our messenger, Muhammad, peace be upon him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is clear that accountability is lifted from those who are coerced. And that also, which is really important, the punishment applies solely to the preparator, the criminal, as affirmed by scholars such as Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. So those are respected scholars in Islam. So Islam categorically rejects victim blaming and does not link the crime to a woman's location, behavior, clothing. So this is evident in a well-known case from the Prophet's time, where a rape survivor was believed and she was protected and absolved of any blame, while the offender alone was punished. So so-called honor, I would say, is not compromised by the victim, and the shame lies entirely with the crime and criminal. And a point actually emphasized by modern scholars, including like Muhammad Tantawi, and that children born as a result of rape are fully innocent. They are entitled to dignity and full rights and must never be stigmatized. So in essence, I would say that Islam stands with the oppressed, placing like full legal and moral responsibility on the criminal, recognizing the victim's right to justice, to compensation, and also rejecting stigma, rejecting silence, rejecting victim blaming in all forms. So this is how Islam is looking at this issue.
Yeah, that's very clear. But as you've also said, distinct from religion, there is a very strong cultural dimension. In Sudan, the women who have been raped are stigmatized by the society. So, what do we know about the prevalent culture and why there is this cultural stigma, leaving religion aside, about rape women? By the way, this is not just in Islamic or Middle Eastern societies. It's true all over the world. Any thoughts on that from your experience? And what's the lived experience of the women and girls who have been raped? What's happening to the victims and survivors in Sudan now?
Okay, so this is where we reach the painful gap between religion and culture, because some people are mixing culture and religion. So we are people of the Middle East and Africa. We are not all Muslims. So culture are playing, unfortunately, a bad role, a negative role in this case. So in many societies, particularly in Africa and Middle East, dominant cultural norms still tend to blame women instead of protecting victims, which is really weird. Like, a woman's dignity is often reduced to the concept of honor, and rape is treated as a scandal rather than a serious crime. As a result, the victim is socially punished while the criminal frequently escapes accountability. The lived experience of women and girls who survive rape is often deeply traumatic. There is initial psychological shock followed by enforced silence, by social stigma. In many cases, even it's followed by rejection by family, by community. That is placing the burden of that crime on the victim herself, not on the criminal. So, in the most tragic cases, under the pretext of social honor, in Sudan, rape being used as a weapon of war, this reality is even more severe. So, many survivors committed suicide because of stigma. Many survivors don't want to report, and they endured out of fear of stigma, retaliation, or losing what like little safety they have left. So this is really bad. And what we are witnessing is not authentic culture. Has nothing to do with Islam, but this is a system of silence, of impunity that must be confronted by accountability and protection for survivors, and justice be restored.
Let's come to men. Your film is unique because the rape of men is less talked about, and yet you managed to get a man's testimony into the film. Can you say a bit more on the challenges in society men face if they have been raped?
That's a very hard question to talk about a man who was raped. But let me tell you, his story is really so sad. He's a Sudanese doctor who was raped multiple times by the RSF soldiers after they killed his friend in front of his eyes. I won't go into many details about his story, but what really hurt me is that he has not shared his story with any member of his family until now, because as a man, he feels unable to talk about something like this with anyone. He's going through severe depression, has gained a lot of weight, and he says that he wouldn't be able to live among people if they knew what happened to him, because it's considered a great stigma in society. So this is so sad to hear.
Sticking with the men theme, and you've done a lot of research on this, obviously, as you were making your documentary. Can you reflect on why Sudanese men fighters, RSF, rape so casually, including children and elderly people? And why is it that often accompanied by so much brutality? So it's not just a sexual act, it's a brutality act. Where is that coming from? And how is that sustained in the ecosystem of the Sudan war? So I'm trying to ask you to put yourself in the mindset of the rapist. We have talked about the victims or the survivors. What about the rapist? What kind of person rapes?
I cannot put myself in his shoes, but I will try. I think there are many reasons behind this brutality and this deliberate use of humiliation that's adopted by those militia. First of all, if we think about the structure of this militia, the RSF, they are not like a regular army with a military doctrine or institutional discipline, and this is very clear. Rather, they are a mix of fighters. They are not all Sudanese. Most of them are actually coming from different countries, recruited with money, like essentially mercenaries. So a soldier who fights without honor solely for money and not to protect even his homeland. So they got no purpose other than money. It's fundamentally driven by the pursuit of pleasure, the pursuit of personal gains only. So he lacks core moral values and does not abide by any rules, which can make him easily do this. So I would also say that there are numerous studies that have proven the connection between those militia and drugs consumption in Sudan. Drugs also can unleash levels of violence that is unexpected for and far worse than we are witnessing. Let me also tell you, and this is the most important thing, that those militia members have a long history of engaging in killing and rape in Darfur were left unpunished. So they gained significant power and influence within Sudan over time. So this history of impunity pushes the militia to commit crimes actually without fear of accountability. The use of extreme violence and brutality helps them to create terror. It forces civilians to abandon their land out of fear of what they hear, what they witness. And this is in turn allows actually the militia members to seize larger areas more quickly and with less resistance.
So there is a wider context. That's quite important. You put it very well. Zooming out a bit from war affected Sudan, sexual violence takes place also in peace times. I'm thinking of human trafficking, slavery, forced and child marriages, domestic violence, and so on in many, many countries around the world. Some figures from the World Health Organization indicate that a third of females experience some or other form of sexual violence in their lifetime. So I wonder if the way women are abused during wars is simply an exaggerated way of how they're treated in so-called normal times. This is a bigger question and a difficult one. But what are your thoughts on preventing sexual violence in both war and peace?
So what women are subjected to in wars is not a separate phenomenon. It's an intensified extension of patterns of violence that already exist in times of peace. I think war doesn't create sexual violence, if you ask me. It removes the legal and moral constraints that once limited sexual violence in society. It allows it to become more widespread, more visible. So rape and conflict is not a random individual act. Rape and conflict is a crime committed within a context of impunity and used to break communities, to subjugate them. Therefore, it cannot be treated as an exceptional behavior linked only to war, but part of a bigger picture, a social structure that permits violence and silence victims. So prevention, I think, doesn't start on the battlefield, but recognizing that sexual violence is a crime in its own right. It's building effective systems of accountability in a country before even war begins, not after war starts. This is important.
Very well put, Rama. Looking to the future, it's unlikely that Sudan's agony will be over anytime soon, tragically. What's your reflection on the legacy, the wider, longer impact of sexual violence for that country? How does the systematic use of rape as a weapon of war in Sudan affect the search for peace and then, in the longer term, on sustaining Sudanese society in peaceful stability?
And this is a very deep question.
I only ask deep questions from you. I guess I'm asking this experience of brutalized, raped society, does it affect the chances of making peace and keeping peace in the future?
Actually, this is a very hard question, but let me tell you this. I think that sexual violence destroys not only individuals, but entire societies, as I told, creating deep psychological trauma and social fractures that last for decades. So the harm is compounded by structures that stigmatize survivors. It treats them as criminals. It punishes their children. It's leading their families to break down, family exile, and even suicide. So this devastation, I would say, erodes the social fabric and undermines a chance of peace. Rape as a weapon of war doesn't end with the fighting without recognition and accountability. It continues to reproduce violence again. So a society wounded at this depth cannot be expected to coexist with that system that is built on killing and rape. And in such a situation, peace is not sustainable at all.
So, sexual violence in wartime has a profound effect on subsequent society and therefore peace and
Sure.
stability. Uh, as we get to the end of our conversation, can I get a bit personal? What has it been like for you while discharging this assignment? It's obviously harrowing. Your words have made that clear. But how did you personally react and cope? I ask because I find it much more disturbing than I expected. And I was just, an observer. When your camera crew came to my home near Geneva to interview me, it seemed that their entry into my quiet little home in this peaceful corner of the world brought a whole rush of horrible memories of my own time in Sudan that I had buried, speaking about the psychological consequences. This is not blaming your team. They were the gentlest of professionals. And of course, my own historical traumas are trivial in relation to what the people have experienced. So I'm asking you, as a producer and as a journalist and of all this, how did it affect you personally?
So, first of all, I want to say that I'm truly sorry if our work caused you pain by reopening memories of the suffering you witnessed during your service with the United Nations in Sudan. I understand this very well, and I understand very well how certain cases, questions, or moments can suddenly bring buried memories back to the surface. So for me, this experience wasn't easy at all, especially as a woman. Preparing this documentary was a director Islam Aql meant months of research, searching for survivors, reading extensively about rape and all its forms, actually, like gang rape, sexual slavery, trafficking of women, watching videos in which RSF soldiers openly boast about committing these crimes. Then came listening to the survivors' stories, not once, but dozens of times throughout the production process, all the way until the film was finally aired. Because it was extremely heavy. In the period, me and the director, we actually suffered from recurring nightmares. I lost my appetite and lost weight because I simply couldn't eat. Like similar things happened to the director as well. Even after the documentary was completed, like we still had to watch it multiple times for technical and editing process. So there were moments when we had to stop halfway because we could no longer bear to hear their stories again and again and again. So if this is how deeply we were affected, what we did only is documenting their stories. So I cannot even imagine how the victims are feeling or are living. So what about those who actually live through them? This is not easy burden for any human being to carry, and it stays with you long after the work is done.
Well, my dear, you and your colleagues have done a great public service by bringing us this film, this documentary. Will you continue with this theme? What type of projects and ambitions are you cooking as you move forward in your professional life?
Actually, for us, this mission of the documentary will only be complete when awareness around this crime grows wider and when the world truly pays attention and when real actions are taken to stop the war in Sudan and to hold criminals accountable. So, of course, we will continue this work as this is our duty as journalists. On a personal level, I continue to write and publish about the Sudanese case because this story is far from over. It's still going on. And As for upcoming projects, I'm currently working on a new documentary about genocide in Gaza. So, God willing, it will be released soon, inshallah. So, this is another story that must be told clearly, like honestly, and with humanity.
With humanity. A final thought, dear listeners. This film is called Land of Victims. I wonder whether it should really have been called Land of Heroes. As one viewer said on the YouTube uh, uh, channel, where it's available in Arabic with English subtitles on TRT Arab's channel, Victims of Heroes. You can decide, dear listeners, after watching. I hope you will do so because averting your eyes would insult the remarkable souls who, despite unimaginable suffering, show amazing dignity and defiance, testifying to the resilience of the human spirit. And therein lies the hope for the tortured people of Sudan and countless other brutal conflicts. So to watch and reflect on their tragic lives is the least we can do. And who knows, perhaps we then may get fired up to do more than just to look. Rahmet Elfikhi, thank you for being my most eye opening guest on Fading Causes.
Thank you so much for giving me the space to speak and for giving space to these voices and for allowing this conversation to exist.